He'd been looking forward to this camping trip for months. After a long drive up the winding mountain roads of Vermont, my buddy Mike and I finally arrived at Green Mountain National Forest. The sun was setting as we pulled into the secluded campsite, casting long shadows through the dense pine trees. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. As we got out of the car, I noticed how quiet it was. No distant traffic, no chatter from other campers, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, but something about the stillness made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Mike seemed oblivious, eagerly unloading our gear. "Man, this is gonna be awesome," he exclaimed, tossing me a backpack. Total disconnect from the world, just like we planned. I forced a smile, trying to shake off my unease. "Yeah, totally," I replied, scanning the surrounding forest. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. As we started to unpack, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a pair of eyes glinting in the growing darkness. But there was nothing, just endless trees and lengthening shadows. We worked quickly to set up our tent before it got too dark. The sound of tent poles clicking into place and the rustle of nylon seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. Mike chatted away, but I found myself constantly distracted, peering into the deepening gloom between the trees. "Hey, Earth to Jake!" Mike's voice snapped me back to reality. "You gonna help me with this, or what?" "Sorry, man," I mumbled, focusing on hammering in the tent stakes. As we finished setting up, the last rays of sunlight disappeared, plunging the forest into darkness. We flicked on our headlamps, the beams cutting through the night like searchlights. The shadows danced and shifted, playing tricks on my eyes. We got a fire going, the flames casting a warm glow around our little campsite. As we sat around the fire, roasting hot dogs, Mike regaled me with stories about his last camping trip. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. Mike noticed my nervousness and laughed it off. "Dude, relax. It's just nature doing its thing. Nothing to worry about out here." I nodded, forcing a laugh, but I couldn't help feeling that we were intruders in a place that didn't want us there. As the fire died down to embers, we decided to turn in for the night. The darkness pressed in around us as we zipped ourselves into the tent. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling, listening to Mike's breathing slowly even out as he drifted off to sleep. I was just starting to relax when I heard it, a low, guttural sound coming from somewhere in the forest. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a moan, but something in between. My heart started racing as I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction it was coming from. The noise came again, closer this time. It sounded almost human, but distorted, like someone in pain. I nudged Mike, but he just mumbled and rolled over. Suddenly, there was a loud snap of a branch breaking right outside our tent. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. Something was out there, moving around our campsite. I could hear heavy footsteps circling the tent, accompanied by deep, ragged breathing. My hand inched towards the flashlight, but I was too terrified to turn it on. What if the light attracted whatever was out there? The footsteps stopped, right by my head. There was a moment of utter silence, then a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the tent walls. The events of the night felt like a bad dream, but the knot of fear in my stomach told me it had been all too real. I shook Mike awake, and we cautiously unzipped the tent. The campsite looked normal in the morning light, but something was off. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Our cooler was missing. "Did you move the cooler last night?" I asked Mike, my voice shaky. He shook his head, looking confused. "No, why would I? It was right here by the fire pit. We searched the area, thinking maybe we had misremembered where we put it, but it was nowhere to be found. And it wasn't just the cooler. Our bag of trail mix was gone, and so was the package of beef jerky we'd left in one of the backpacks. Maybe it was a bear?" Mike suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. A bear would have made a mess. This is too deliberate. We stood there, looking at each other, the same unspoken question in our eyes. Who or what had been in our campsite last night? The peaceful morning suddenly felt ominous. The chirping birds and rustling leaves that had seemed so innocent before now sounded like they were hiding secrets, mocking our growing fear. As we discussed what to do next, I noticed something in the soft earth near where the cooler had been. At first, I thought it was just an odd depression in the ground, but as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. "Mike," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "Come look at this." He came over, and I pointed to the ground. There, clearly visible in the dirt, was a footprint. But it wasn't like any footprint I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, and the shape was all wrong. The toes were too long, almost claw-like, and there was something off about the arch of the foot. Mike crouched down to get a better look. "What the hell made that?" he muttered. I shook my head, at a loss for words. We followed the tracks, finding more scattered around the campsite. They seemed to lead off into the dense undergrowth of the forest. "Should we follow them?" Mike asked, a mix of fear and curiosity in his voice. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then and there. But another part, the part that needed answers, was pushing me to investigate further. "Let's at least see where they go," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We grabbed our backpacks and a couple of sturdy sticks, just in case, and set off into the woods, following the trail of bizarre footprints. We hadn't gone far when we heard voices coming through the trees. Relief washed over me. Other people. Maybe they could help us make sense of what was going on. We emerged into a small clearing to find two men in hunting gear, rifles slung over their shoulders. They looked surprised to see us. "You boys shouldn't be out here," the older of the two said, his voice gruff. "We're camping just back there," I explained, pointing back the way we'd come. "But something strange happened last night. We found these weird footprints and—" The hunters exchanged a look that made my words trail off. There was something in their eyes. Was it fear? "Listen," the younger hunter said, his voice low and urgent. "You need to pack up and get out of these woods. Now." "Why?" Mike asked. "What's going on?" The older hunter spit on the ground. "Nothing good. There have been incidents. Animals gone missing campers reporting strange noises and sightings. Sightings of what? I pressed. They looked at each other again, seeming to debate whether to tell us more. Something that shouldn't exist, the older one finally said. Something that ain't natural. Now go on. Get yourselves to safety before nightfall. With that, they hurried off, leaving us standing there, more confused and frightened than ever. Despite the hunter's warning, we decided to press on. We needed to find our missing supplies, and part of me hoped that if we could just solve this mystery, everything would make sense again. As we followed the strange tracks deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us. The cheerful bird song from earlier had faded, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by our footsteps and heavy breathing. Suddenly, Mike grabbed my arm. "Look," he whispered, pointing ahead. There, hanging from a low branch, was a scrap of fabric. As we got closer, my stomach lurched. It was a piece of a tent, the same color and material as ours. But it was shredded, as if something with massive claws had torn through it like paper. Around the base of the tree, the ground was disturbed. There were more of those strange footprints, along with what looked horribly like drag marks leading further into the woods. "Jake," Mike's voice was shaky. I think that's blood." He was right. Dark stains spattered the leaves and ground, already turning brown in the warm air. The implications of what we were seeing hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone else had been out here, and something terrible had happened to them. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to get help." Mike nodded, his face pale. We turned to head back to our campsite, moving faster now, driven by a growing sense of panic. The trek back to our campsite felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than 30 minutes. Every sound made us jump. A twig snapping underfoot, leaves rustling in the breeze. The forest that had seemed so peaceful yesterday now felt malevolent, as if the trees themselves were watching us with hostile intent. When we finally reached our tent, we started throwing our belongings into our backpacks haphazardly. We needed to get out of there, fast. "What do you think that thing is?" Mike asked, his voice tight with fear. I shook my head. "I don't know, man. Some kind of animal, maybe? A bear that's gone wrong somehow?" But even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. What kind of bear left footprints like that? What kind of animal was smart enough to open a cooler without leaving a mess? As we packed, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous shape emerge from the trees. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. I could feel panic building in my chest, making it hard to breathe. "We're being watched," I whispered to Mike. "Can't you feel it?" He nodded, his eyes wide. "Let's just get out of here, Jake. Please." We shouldered our packs, ready to make a run for the car. But as we turned to leave, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest, stopping us in our tracks. The scream faded, leaving us frozen in terror. It had sounded human, but distorted, filled with a pain and fear that made my skin crawl. "We have to help," Mike said, but his voice was shaking. I knew he was right, but every instinct was screaming at me to run. Before we could decide what to do, something caught my eye. A faint, pulsing light deep in the woods. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Mike nodded. his face pale in the fading daylight. The light was unlike anything I'd ever seen, not the steady beam of a flashlight or the warm glow of a campfire. It pulsed with an eerie, greenish-blue light, seeming to beckon us deeper into the forest. Against our better judgment, we found ourselves moving towards it. The light grew stronger as we approached, casting strange, shifting shadows on the trees around us. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. As we got closer, we could make out multiple points of light, moving in a pattern that seemed almost intelligent. They danced and swirled, sometimes coming together to form shapes I couldn't quite make sense of. Suddenly, the lights blinked out, plunging us into darkness. In the silence that followed, we heard it. Heavy breathing and the snap of branches coming right towards us. We ran. Blind panic drove us back towards our campsite, stumbling over roots and crashing through underbrush. Behind us, I could hear something large moving through the forest, gaining on us with every second. We burst into the clearing where our tent stood and dove inside, zipping it up behind us as if the thin nylon could protect us from whatever was out there. We huddled in the darkness, trying to quiet our ragged breathing. Outside, something circled the tent. Heavy footsteps crunched in the leaves, punctuated by deep, guttural breathing that sounded almost like words in a language I couldn't understand. "What do we do?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. I shook my head, too terrified to speak. The thing outside stopped moving. For a long moment, there was complete silence. Then, slowly, a shape pressed against the side of the tent. A massive hand or paw, with long, curved claws that snagged in the fabric. I bit back a scream as the shape moved, tracing the contour of the tent as if searching for a way in. We pressed ourselves against the opposite side, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever was out there. The exploring hand paused over where we were huddled. I could hear sniffing, loud and deliberate. It knew we were in here. It was toying with us. We couldn't stay in the tent. It was only a matter of time before the creature found a way in or simply tore through the fabric. We needed to make a run for it. "On three," I whispered to Mike. We unzip the tent and sprint for the car. "Don't look back, just run. Ready?" He nodded, his face pale in the dim light. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. 1, 2, 3. We burst out of the tent, the sudden movement seeming to catch the creature by surprise. I caught a glimpse of something massive and dark, but I forced myself not to look directly at it. We ran faster than I thought possible, driven by pure adrenaline and terror. Behind us, an inhuman roar shook the air. The sound of pursuit was immediate, crashing footsteps and the snap of breaking branches. The car was so close, just beyond the next line of trees. Suddenly, Mike cried out. I glanced back to see him stumble, his foot caught in a tangle of roots. Without thinking, I turned back to help him. That's when I saw it clearly, for the first time. The creature was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, with long, powerful limbs and a body covered in matted, dark fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with glowing eyes that fixed on us with terrifying intelligence. As it lunged towards us, I knew with sickening certainty that we weren't going to make it to the car. In a split-second decision, I hauled Mike to his feet and we veered off the path, plunging deeper into the woods. It was a desperate move, but I hoped the dense undergrowth might slow the creature down. We crashed through the forest, branches whipping at our faces and thorns tearing at our clothes. The sound of pursuit was constant, sometimes fading slightly only to surge closer again. It was toying with us, I realized with horror. It could have caught us at any time, but it was drawing out the chase. I had no idea where we were going. In the darkness, all the trees looked the same. We could have been running in circles for all I knew. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. "Jake!" Mike gasped beside me. I can't keep going." I grabbed his arm, half dragging him along. "We have to," I panted. "We can't stop." But even as I said it, I knew we were running out of options. We were hopelessly lost, exhausted, and the creature seemed tireless in its pursuit. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, the ground suddenly disappeared beneath our feet. We tumbled down a steep slope, rolling through leaves and underbrush before coming to a painful stop at the bottom. Dazed and bruised, we lay there for a moment, trying to catch our breath. The forest was eerily quiet, no sign of our pursuer. Had we lost it? "Where are we?" Mike whispered, his voice hoarse. I sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in my ribs. We were in some kind of ravine, the sides rising steeply on either side of us. In the dim moonlight filtering through the trees, I could make out the dark mouth of a cave in the rock face nearby. I think we might be able to hide in there," I said, pointing to the cave. Mike looked skeptical, but we didn't have many options. We staggered to our feet and made our way towards the cave entrance, every sound making us flinch and look over our shoulders. As we entered the cave, the darkness swallowed us. The air was damp and cold, with a musty smell that made me gag. We moved deeper, feeling our way along the rough stone walls, hoping to find a place to hide and catch our breath. But as we rounded a bend, a faint glow ahead made us freeze in our tracks. The glow grew stronger as we cautiously moved forward. It was the same eerie pulsing light we had seen earlier in the forest. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the cave. "Should we turn back?" Mike whispered. But before I could answer, a low growl echoed through the cave behind us. The creature had found our trail. We had no choice but to press on. As we rounded another bend, the cave opened up into a sunny cavern. What we saw there made us stop dead in our tracks. The walls were covered in strange, glowing symbols that pulsed with that otherworldly light. In the center of the cavern stood what looked like an altar made of rough stone, surrounded by bones. Some animal, some disturbingly human-like. But what truly chilled me to the bone was the figure standing at the altar. It was tall and gaunt, with pale, almost translucent skin. Its head was elongated and hairless, with large black eyes that reflected the pulsing light. It turned to look at us, and I felt my mind reeling, unable to fully comprehend what I was seeing. "Welcome," it said, in a voice that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly into my mind. "We've been waiting for you." Behind us, heavy footsteps approached. We were trapped between the creature that had been hunting us and this thing that defied explanation. "What are you?" I managed to croak out. The being's lipless mouth curved into what might have been a smile. "We are the caretakers," it said, "and you are about to become part of something greater." My mind was reeling, trying to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare or hallucination. The being at the altar raised its long, spindly arms, and the symbols on the walls pulsed brighter. Behind us, I could hear the heavy breathing of the creature that had chased us through the forest. "Your fear has made you perfect vessels," the being said, its voice resonating in my head. "Your bodies will serve as gateways for our kind to enter your world." Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The missing campers, the strange occurrences in the forest. This thing, whatever it was, had been luring people here, using the forest creature as its hunting dog. "Run!" I yelled to Mike, snapping out of my daze. We bolted towards a narrow passage on the far side of the cavern, our only chance of escape. The being let out a piercing shriek that felt like it was splitting my skull. The forest creature roared and charged after us. We sprinted down the twisting passage, the sound of pursuit close behind. The tunnel seemed endless, branching off in different directions. We took turns at random, driven by blind panic. The glowing symbols were everywhere, pulsing faster now, as if the whole cave system was coming alive. I could feel something changing in the air, a building pressure that made my ears pop. Whatever that being was planning, it was happening now. We had to get out before it was too late. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw a glimmer of natural light ahead. With a final burst of energy, we raced towards it, bursting out of the cave into the pre-dawn forest. We didn't stop running until we couldn't hear any sounds of pursuit. Finally, gasping for breath, we collapsed on the forest floor. As the sky lightened with the approaching dawn, we looked at each other, both trying to process what we just experienced. What was that thing?" Mike panted. I shook my head, still struggling to believe it myself. "I don't know, but I think we just narrowly avoided being part of some kind of invasion." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what had happened settling over us. Then, in the distance, we heard a sound that made my heart leap. Car engines. We were near a road. Helping each other up, we stumbled towards the sound. As we emerged from the tree line onto a highway, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We've made it out. But as we stood there, trying to flag down a car, I couldn't shake the feeling that our escape had been too easy. The being's words echoed in my mind. "You are about to become part of something greater." I looked at Mike, saw the same unease in his eyes. We were out of the forest, but were we truly safe? Or had we unknowingly brought something back with us? Something that was just waiting for the right moment to emerge. As a car finally slowed to pick us up, I couldn't help but wonder, was this really the end of our ordeal? Or just the beginning of something much, much worse? I've always loved the great outdoors, so when my buddies from college suggested a weekend camping trip in the Adirondacks, I jumped at the chance. It was mid-October, and the fall colors were at their peak. We picked a remote trail that promised breathtaking views and peaceful solitude Little did I know that this trip would turn into a nightmare I'd never forget. Our group consisted of 5 of us: me, Jake, Sarah, Mike, and Lisa. We'd been friends since our freshman year at Syracuse University, and we tried to get together at least once a year for an adventure. This time, Jake had found a supposedly hidden gem of a trail that wasn't too crowded. We packed our gear, loaded up Jake's old Jeep Cherokee, and hit the road early Friday morning. The drive up was filled with laughter, stories, and excited chatter about the hike ahead. We stopped at a small diner in a quaint town for a hearty breakfast, savoring our last taste of civilization before heading into the wilderness. As we approached the trailhead, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The forest seemed darker, more ominous than I remembered from previous hikes. I brushed it off as pre-trip jitters and focused on double-checking our supplies. Little did I know, those instincts were trying to warn me of the terror that awaited us in those woods. We reached the trailhead around noon, shouldered our heavy backpacks, and set off into the dense forest. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves and pine. As we hiked deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the crunch of our boots and the occasional bird call. After a few hours of trekking uphill, we finally reached our designated campsite. It was a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines, with a babbling brook nearby. We were all exhausted, but excited to set up camp. Jake and Mike started pitching the tents, while Sarah, Lisa, and I gathered firewood and filled our water bottles from the stream. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our campsite, we huddled around the crackling fire. We roasted hot dogs, shared stories, and gazed up at the stars peeking through the canopy above. It was the perfect start to our weekend getaway. But as night fell, the forest seemed to close in around us. The darkness between the trees felt almost solid, and the once cheerful crackling of our fire now sounded more like whispered warnings. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild in the unfamiliar surroundings. If only I had listened to that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. If only we had packed up and left right then. But we didn't. We crawled into our tents, zipped up our sleeping bags, and drifted off to sleep, blissfully unaware of the horrors that awaited us in the depths of the night. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The camping trip, the Adirondacks, our cozy little campsite. But something felt off. The night was eerily quiet, save for an odd, rhythmic sound coming from just beyond our camp. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or some nocturnal animal. But as I lay there, straining my ears, I realized it sounded more like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Circling our campsite, I held my breath, hoping it would stop. Instead, it grew closer. Then, a twig snapped loudly right outside my tent. I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Hey," I whispered, nudging Jake, who was snoring softly beside me. "Wake up. Do you hear that?" Jake stirred groggily. "Hear what?" he mumbled. But just then, we both froze. A low, guttural growl echoed through the night, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear or a wolf. It was something else entirely. We unzipped the tent slowly, peering out into the darkness. The moonlight cast strange shadows, making the trees look like looming figures. And there, just at the edge of our campsite, I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the dim light. They blinked once, then vanished. I didn't sleep a wink for the rest of the night. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I convinced myself it had all been a product of my overactive imagination. But the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. Something was out there watching us, and I had a sinking feeling that our nightmare was just beginning. As the sun rose, casting a golden glow over our campsite, we emerged from our tents, bleary-eyed and on edge. I tried to bring up the strange noises from the night before, but Jake brushed it off, saying it was probably just a raccoon or a deer. The others hadn't heard anything, and I started to doubt myself. We gathered around the cold remains of last night's fire, planning our day's hike. That's when we realized something was wrong. Lisa was missing. Her tent was empty, her sleeping bag still neatly rolled up inside. Maybe she went to use the bathroom? Sarah suggested, but the worry in her voice was evident. We called out for Lisa, our voices echoing through the trees. No response. Panic started to set in as we searched the immediate area. There was no sign of her anywhere. Her hiking boots were still by her tent, and her backpack untouched. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. "We need to find her," Mike said, his face pale with concern. "She wouldn't just wander off without her shoes or gear." As we stood there, debating what to do, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of our campsite, partially hidden by fallen leaves, were drag marks in the dirt. They led off into the dense underbrush, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The reality of our situation hit me like a punch to the gut. Lisa wasn't just missing. Something had taken her, and whatever it was, it might still be out there, waiting. The woods that had seemed so welcoming yesterday now felt like a sinister trap closing in around us. We were no longer the hunters enjoying nature. We had become the prey. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on us as we hurriedly packed some supplies. We couldn't just sit around waiting for help. Lisa was out there somewhere, possibly hurt or in danger. We had to find her. Jake took charge, his years as a Boy Scout kicking in. "We'll split into 2 groups," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Mike and Sarah, you 2 head back down the trail to try and get cell service, call for help, and then come back here to wait in case Lisa returns. You'll go with Alex to follow these drag marks and see if we can find any sign of her." We agreed on a plan to meet back at the campsite in 3 hours, no matter what. Sarah handed out the few protein bars we had left, and we filled our water bottles from the stream. The gravity of what we were about to do hung in the air like a thick fog. As Mike and Sarah disappeared down the trail, Jake and I stood at the edge of the campsite, staring into the dense forest where the drag marks led. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, dark and foreboding. Every shadow could be hiding something sinister. Every rustle of leaves a potential threat. "Ready?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. With a deep breath, we stepped off the relative safety of our campsite and into the unknown. The forest swallowed us up, branches scratching at our arms as if trying to hold us back. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something out there was waiting for us to make a mistake. As we followed the faint trail, my mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What had happened to Lisa? And more importantly, what would we find at the end of these drag marks? I gripped my walking stick tighter, trying to prepare myself for whatever horrors lay ahead. Jake and I pushed deeper into the forest, following the intermittent drag marks. The dense canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight, casting everything in an eerie, green-tinged twilight. Every snapping twig under our feet sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a small clearing. What we saw there made my stomach lurch. Lisa's bright red bandana lay crumpled on the ground, partially covered in leaves. Next to it was her water bottle. The plastic cracked and empty. "Oh God," Jake whispered, his face ashen. What happened here? As we searched the area, my foot caught on something. I looked down and immediately wished I hadn't. Half buried in the dirt was a large, curved claw, easily the size of my hand. It wasn't from any animal I recognized. "Jake," I called, my voice shaking. "You need to see this." He came over, his eyes widening at the sight. That's not possible," he muttered. But there was more. As we scanned the clearing, we noticed deep gouges in the bark of the surrounding trees. They were too high up and too wide apart to be from a bear. Whatever made them was big, and it was angry. The implications of what we were seeing started to sink in. This wasn't a simple case of a lost hiker. Something was out here, something dangerous and possibly not entirely natural. As if on cue, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees, raising the hair on the back of my neck. It was the same sound I'd heard last night, but closer now, much closer. Jake and I locked eyes, both realizing the same thing. We weren't the hunters anymore. We were being hunted, and our predator was closing in. The growl faded, leaving behind a silence so complete it was deafening. Jake and I stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Then, without warning, a massive shape burst from the underbrush behind us. "Run!" Jake yelled, shoving me forward. We took off, crashing through the forest with reckless abandon. Branches whipped at our faces. Roots threatened to trip us at every step. The sound of heavy footfalls and splintering wood followed close behind. I don't know how long we ran. My lungs were on fire, my legs numb. Suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I was falling, tumbling down a steep ravine. I hit the bottom hard. The wind knocked out of me as I lay there, gasping for air. I realized I couldn't hear Jake anymore. "Jake!" I called out, my voice hoarse. No response. The forest had gone quiet again, save for the pounding of my own heart. I struggled to my feet, wincing at the pain in my ankle. I was alone, lost in an unfamiliar part of the woods. The sun was setting, painting the sky in reds and purples visible through the canopy. Night was coming, and with it, the creature that hunted us. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I had no idea which direction the campsite was or where Jake had ended up. My backpack was gone, lost in the frantic run or the fall. I had no food, no water, and no way to call for help. As the last light faded, the forest came alive with night sounds. Every rustle, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I limped forward, picking a direction at random, hoping against hope to find my way back to safety. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was lost, injured, and being stalked by something I couldn't even begin to understand. And the night was just beginning. I don't know how long I stumbled through the darkening forest. My ankle throbbed with each step, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Just as despair was about to overtake me, I spotted a break in the trees ahead. Limping forward, I found myself in front of an old, dilapidated cabin. Its windows were boarded up, the porch sagging dangerously. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have gone near such a creepy place. But these weren't normal circumstances. I approached cautiously, the old floorboards creaking under my weight. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and with a deep breath, I pushed it open. The interior was musty and dark. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. But it was shelter, and right now, that's all that mattered. I fumbled in my pocket for my lighter, grateful I hadn't lost it in the fall. The small flame cast eerie shadows on the walls as I explored. There was an old fireplace, a rickety table, and a few broken chairs. In one corner stood a rusty metal bed frame with a moldy mattress. But it was what I found on the table that made my blood run cold. There were maps of the area, much older than ours, with strange markings all over them. Next to them lay a journal, its pages yellow with age. With shaking hands, I opened it. The entries, dating back decades, detailed sightings of a creature in these woods. A creature that matched what we had encountered. The writer described it as ancient, cunning, and utterly malevolent. The final entry chilled me to the bone. It's not just killing anymore. It's hunting, playing with its food. God help anyone who ventures into these woods. As if in response to my discovery, a bone-chilling howl pierced the night air. It was close. Too close. I scrambled to extinguish my lighter, plunging the cabin into darkness. As I huddled in a corner, I realized with growing horror that I had unwittingly walked right into the lair of the beast. I spent the night huddled in that dusty corner, every creak and groan of the old cabin making me flinch. Sleep was impossible. As the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, I finally dared to move. My body ached from the uncomfortable position, and my injured ankle had swollen considerably. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to find Jake and the others, to warn them about what he had learned. I limped to the cabin door, steeling myself for what might be waiting outside. As I stepped onto the porch, my heart nearly stopped. There, in the soft earth around the cabin, were footprints. But these were like nothing I'd ever seen before. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own foot. The shape was all wrong too, elongated, with what looked like sharp claws at the end of each toe, and they were fresh, the edges still crisp in the morning dew. The tracks circled the entire cabin, as if whatever made them had been searching for a way in. I shuddered at the thought of how close it had been while I huddled inside, unaware. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. Mixed in with these monstrous prints were other, smaller ones, human footprints, and they led away from the cabin into the dense undergrowth. My mind raced. Could it be Jake? Or maybe Lisa? Either way, someone had been here, and recently, and they were being pursued by the creature. I had a choice to make. I could try to find my way back to the campsite, to safety, or I could follow these tracks, potentially saving whoever was out there, but risking my own life in the process. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. I couldn't leave someone out there alone, hunted by this thing. With a deep breath, I stepped off the porch and into the treacherous forest, following the intermingled tracks of predator and prey. I followed the tracks deeper into the forest, my heart pounding with each step. The woods seemed to grow darker and more oppressive the further I went, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. After what felt like hours, I heard something that made me freeze in my tracks. A voice, faint but unmistakably human. It was calling for help. I moved faster, ignoring the pain in my ankle. As I rounded a large boulder, I finally saw her. It was Lisa, alive but trapped. Her leg was caught in what looked like an old, rusted animal trap, its teeth digging cruelly into her calf. Blood had soaked through her torn jeans, and her face was pale with pain and fear. "Alex!" she cried out when she saw me. Oh God, I thought no one would find me. I rushed to her side, examining the trap. It was old and corroded, but still wickedly sharp. "Hold on," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm going to get you out of this." As I worked to pry the trap open, Lisa's words tumbled out in a panicked rush. It took me from the campsite. I woke up, and it was just there, this huge shape in the dark. I couldn't scream. It dragged me through the woods, but I managed to get free and ran. That's when I got caught in this trap. I finally managed to spring the trap open, and Lisa pulled her injured leg free with a pained gasp. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We need to move," I said, helping Lisa to her feet. "Now." We stumbled forward, Lisa leaning heavily on me. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. It was toying with us, I realized. It could have overtaken us at any moment, but it was drawing out the chase, savoring our fear. Suddenly, the creature burst from the trees ahead of us. In the daylight, I finally got a clear look at our tormentor. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with matted fur and long, wickedly curved claws. Its face was a nightmarish blend of bear and something almost human, with intelligent, hate-filled eyes. Lisa screamed. I stood frozen, paralyzed by terror. The beast roared, a sound that shook the very ground beneath our feet. In that moment, I knew with certainty that we were going to die. The creature's roar snapped me out of my paralysis. Grabbing Lisa's hand, I yelled, "Run!" We took off, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. The beast was right behind us, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Every step was agony for Lisa, her injured leg slowing us down. I could hear her ragged breathing, feel her grip on my hand weakening. The monster was gaining on us, its hot breath practically on our necks. We burst into a small clearing, and I spotted a narrow crevice in a rocky outcropping. "There!" I shouted, pulling Lisa towards it. We squeezed into the gap just as the creature's claws swiped at the space where we had been moments before. The beast roared in frustration, its massive form too large to follow us into the crevice. It paced back and forth, occasionally reaching in with its long arms, trying to grab us. We pressed ourselves as far back as we could, our hearts pounding so loud I was sure it could hear them. For what felt like hours, we remained trapped in that tiny space, the monster circling outside, unwilling to give up its prey. Lisa's leg was bleeding badly, and I could see the pain and exhaustion etched on her face. "We can't stay here forever," she whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. She was right. We were relatively safe for the moment, but we had no food, no water, and Lisa needed medical attention. We had to find a way out. As if sensing our desperation, the creature suddenly let out a bone-chilling howl and charged at our hiding place, slamming its body against the rocks. The impact sent tremors through the outcropping, and I watched in horror as cracks began to form above us. We had to move, and fast, but with the monster blocking our only exit, we were trapped between certain death and possible death. As another impact shook our shelter, I knew we were out of time. We had to make a choice, and we had to make it now. The cracks in the rock above us widened with each impact from the creature. Dust and small stones rained down on us. We couldn't stay put any longer. The entire outcropping was about to come down on our heads. "We have to make a run for it," I told Lisa, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, her face a mask of determination, despite the pain and fear. I peered out of the crevice. The beast was still there, its massive form blocking most of my view. But off to the right, I could see a dense thicket of thorny bushes. It wasn't much, but it was our only chance. "Okay," I whispered, squeezing Lisa's hand. "On 3, we run for those bushes. Ready? 1, 2, 3. We burst out of the crevice just as another impact sent rocks tumbling down behind us. The sudden movement caught the creature off guard, giving us a precious few seconds head start. We sprinted for the thicket, ignoring the thorns that tore at our skin as we dove in. The bushes were thick enough to slow down the monster, but not for long. We could hear it thrashing behind us, roaring in fury. We pushed through the brambles, emerging on the other side bloodied and scratched, but alive. Ahead of us, the ground sloped steeply downward. Without hesitation, we started to descend, half running, half sliding down the incline. Behind us, the creature had broken through the thicket. It was gaining on us fast, using its size to simply plow through obstacles that slowed us down. At the bottom of the slope, we found ourselves in a small ravine. The walls were too steep to climb, and both ends seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. We were trapped. As we stood there, gasping for breath, the monster appeared at the top of the slope. It let out a triumphant roar that echoed off the ravine walls. Slowly, almost lazily, it began to make its way down towards us. It knew we had nowhere left to run. This was the end of the hunt, and we were cornered prey. As the creature descended towards us, my mind raced frantically for a way out. That's when I noticed something odd. Despite its monstrous appearance, there was something familiar about the way it moved. The beast reached the bottom of the ravine, blocking our escape, but instead of attacking, it just stood there, watching us with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Then, to my utter shock, it spoke. "Well, well," it growled, its voice a horrifying mix of animal and human. "Looks like the game is finally over." Lisa gasped beside me. That voice? It can't be. The creature reached up to its head and, in a motion that defied belief, pulled it off like a mask. The monstrous visage fell away, revealing a face I knew all too well. It was Jake. "Surprised?" he asked, a cruel smirk twisting his features. "You should see your faces." I stood there, paralyzed with shock and confusion. Jake, my friend, the one who had organized this trip, was behind all of this? Why? I managed to choke out. Jake's smirk widened into a manic grin. Why? Because it's fun. The thrill of the hunt, the fear in your eyes. It's intoxicating. He gestured to the costume at his feet. This little getup? Found it in that cabin years ago, along with old stories of a monster in these woods. I decided to bring the legend to life. And let me tell you, it's been a blast. As the truth sank in, my shock turned to anger. All the terror, the pain, the desperate fight for survival, it had all been some sick game to Jake. "You're insane," Lisa spat, her voice shaking with rage and disbelief. Jake's eyes darkened. "Insane? Maybe, but I'm not the one trapped at the bottom of a ravine, am I?" He took a step towards us, and I realized with growing horror that the nightmare was far from over. Jake might not be a real monster, but the madness in his eyes told me he was something far worse, a human who had embraced his darkest impulses. As he advanced, I knew we were in for the fight of our lives, and this time there would be no waking up from this nightmare. Jake's revelation had momentarily stunned us, but as he advanced, survival instinct kicked in. I glanced at Lisa, saw the determination in her eyes, and knew we were thinking the same thing. We couldn't outrun him, but maybe we could outsmart him. "Now," I whispered, and we sprang into action. I lunged forward, aiming low to tackle Jake's legs. At the same time, Lisa scooped up a handful of loose rocks and flung them at his face. The double assault caught him off guard. He stumbled, momentarily blinded, and I managed to knock him off balance. We didn't wait to see him fall. Hand in hand, Lisa and I sprinted down the ravine, ignoring the pain of our injuries. Behind us, Jake's enraged roar echoed off the walls, spurring us to run faster. The ravine seemed endless, twisting and turning. Our lungs burned, our legs ached, but we didn't dare slow down. We could hear Jake pursuing us, his longer stride allowing him to gain ground. Just when I thought we couldn't go on any further, the ravine widened, opening into a broader valley. And there, in the distance, we saw something that made my heart leap. Lights. It was the ranger station we had passed on our way to the campsite. "There," I gasped, pointing. "We're almost there." But our hope was short-lived. Jake was right behind us now, close enough that I could hear his labored breathing. In desperation, I looked around for anything we could use to slow him down. That's when I spotted it. A fallen log, precariously balanced on some rocks near the ravine's exit. It was risky, but it was our only chance. As we reached the log, I let go of Lisa's hand. "Keep running," I yelled. "He'll be right behind you." I grabbed the log, straining with all my might to shift it. Jake was almost upon me, his face contorted with rage. With one final heave, I managed to dislodge the log. It came crashing down, rolling towards Jake. He tried to dodge, but the narrow ravine gave him nowhere to go. The log caught him, sending him tumbling backward. I didn't wait to see if he got up. I turned and ran, my legs pumping furiously as I sprinted after Lisa towards the glowing promise of safety ahead. We burst into the ranger station, gasping and barely able to stand. The startled ranger on duty took one look at our battered, blood-stained appearance and immediately called for help. Within minutes, the small building was swarming with park rangers and emergency responders. As paramedics tended to our injuries, we told our story. At first, I could see the disbelief in their eyes, but as more rangers returned from searching the area, reporting the abandoned campsite, the old cabin, and signs of struggle in the woods, their skepticism turned to grim understanding. They found Jake a few hours later, unconscious but alive, pinned under the log in the ravine. He was arrested on the spot. Later, we would learn that this wasn't his first time playing this twisted game. There had been other missing hikers in these woods over the years, cases that had gone unsolved. Until now. Physically, Lisa and I recovered from our ordeal. The cuts and bruises healed, and with time, even Lisa's leg mended. But the psychological scars ran deeper. Nightmares plagued our sleep, and every snapping twig or rustle of leaves would send our hearts racing. Months later, as I sat in the courtroom watching Jake's trial, I realized that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones from legends or campfire stories. They're the ones hiding behind friendly faces, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. I don't go camping anymore. The woods that once brought me peace now only evoke terror. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself wondering, are there more like Jake out there? More human monsters, wearing masks of normalcy, waiting to turn someone else's life into a living nightmare? It's a thought that keeps me up at night, a fear that lingers long after the physical danger has passed, because now I know the truth. Sometimes, the real horror story is the one you don't see coming until it's too late. I'd been looking forward to this camping trip for months. My buddies and I had planned it as a way to blow off steam after a grueling semester at UCLA. We pulled up to Shadow Pine Campground in my beat-up Ford pickup, the California sun dipping below the tree line. The place was more secluded than it expected, tucked away in a dense forest off Route 395. As we approached the entrance, I noticed the worn-out sign barely clinging to its post. The ranger station looked deserted, with cobwebs decorating the windows. Jake, always the joker, quipped, "Looks like the start of every horror movie ever." We laughed it off, but a nagging feeling settled in my gut. We drove deeper into the campground, passing empty sites. The silence was eerie, no chirping birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of gravel under our tires. We finally found our spot, a clearing surrounded by towering pines that seemed to lean in, watching us. As we stepped out of the truck, the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. I chalked it up to the long drive and my overactive imagination. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would push us to our limits and change us forever. We got to work setting up our tents, trying to shake off the weird vibe. The sun was almost gone now, casting long shadows across our campsite. I fumbled with the tent poles, my hands clumsy in the fading light. Mike started unpacking the cooler, cracking open a few beers to lighten the mood. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced at the tree line, I half expected to see someone or something staring back. But there was nothing there, just darkness creeping in. We got a fire going, the flames casting a warm glow over our little circle. As we sat around, roasting hot dogs and swapping stories, things started to feel normal again. Maybe I was just being paranoid. This was supposed to be fun, right? But then Jake mentioned he thought he saw something move in the woods earlier. We all laughed it off, but I noticed how his eyes kept darting to the shadows beyond our campfire's light. The conversation died down, replaced by an uneasy silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. As we turned in for the night, zipping ourselves into our tents, I couldn't help but feel like we were sealing ourselves in rather than keeping something out. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I woke up with a start, heart pounding. The inside of the tent was pitch black, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came flooding back. The camping trip, Shadow Pine, the uneasy feeling. I fumbled for my phone to check the time. 3:17 a.m. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a moan. It seemed to be coming from just outside our campsite. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, louder this time. It didn't sound like any animal had ever heard. I wanted to wake the others, but fear kept me frozen in my sleeping bag. The noise moved, circling our camp. Twigs snapped under heavy footsteps. Whatever it was big. Suddenly, something brushed against the side of my tent. I bit back a scream, my whole body trembling. The thing outside let out a long, low whine, almost human-like in its desperation. Then, as quickly as it had started, the noises stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. When the first light of dawn finally filtered through the tent fabric, I realized I'd been clutching my flashlight so hard my knuckles were white. As soon as it was light enough, I unzipped my tent and stumbled out, half expecting to see some kind of monster. Instead, the campsite looked normal. Too normal. The guys were still asleep, oblivious to the night's events. I was about to convince myself it had all been a bad dream when I saw them. Footprints. But these weren't from any animal I recognized. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own feet, with long, claw-like impressions at the ends of the toes. They circled our campsite, just like the noises had. My hands shaking, I followed the tracks to where they led into the forest. They disappeared into the underbrush, leaving me staring into the depths of the woods. Something moved in the shadows, and I stumbled backward, my heart in my throat. When the others woke up, I showed them the footprints. Mike suggested it might be a bear, but we all knew bears don't walk on two legs. Jake wanted to pack up and leave, but I convinced them to stay. I needed to know what was out there. As we discussed our plans over a tense breakfast, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, assessed, like prey. After breakfast, We decided to do a supply check before heading out to explore. That's when we noticed things were missing. At first, it was small stuff: a few energy bars, a flashlight, Jake's favorite hunting knife. We accused each other of misplacing things or playing pranks. But then we realized the big stuff was gone too. The extra gas can for the truck, our emergency flare gun, even Mike's satellite phone. This was no joke. Someone or something had raided our camp while we slept. The implications hit us like a punch to the gut. We were miles from civilization with limited supplies and no way to call for help. Panic started to set in. Jake wanted to make a run for it in the truck, but I pointed out we might not have enough gas to make it back to the highway. As we argued about what to do, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The missing items weren't just random. They were all things that could help us escape or signal for help. Whatever was out there, it was smart, and it wanted us to stay. We decided to ration what we had left and stick together. But the question remained, what were we up against? We needed answers, so we decided to hike to the ranger station we'd passed on the way in. The walk was tense, every snapping twig making us jump. When we arrived, the place looked even more decrepit up close. As we approached, the door creaked open. An old man shuffled out, his eyes wild and unfocused. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "It's hungry." Before we could ask what he meant, a younger guy appeared, smiling too wide. "Don't mind my pa," he said. "He's got a wild imagination. What can we do for you, folks?" Something felt off about him. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he smelled like he hadn't bathed in weeks. When I mentioned our missing supplies, his eyes glinted strangely. "Lots of critters in these woods," he said, still grinning. "Best be careful." As we left, promises of a search party ringing hollow in our ears, I glanced back. The old man was watching us, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The younger guy waved, that unnerving smile still plastered on his face. I couldn't shake the feeling we'd just walked away from our only chance at help. Against my better judgment, we decided to search the surrounding woods for our missing supplies. We split into pairs, me with Jake, Mike with Chris. As Jake and I pushed deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us, muffling all sound. That's when we stumbled upon the first body. It was a deer, or what was left of one. Its carcass had been torn apart, organs strewn across the forest floor. But it wasn't the gore that chilled me to the bone. It was the precision. This wasn't the work of a wild animal. The cuts were too clean, too deliberate. We pressed on and soon found something even more disturbing. Hidden behind a thick cluster of trees was a makeshift shelter. Tarps were strung up between branches, creating a crude tent. Inside, we found scraps of clothing, empty food wrappers, and worst of all, Polaroid photos. The photos showed people, campers, hikers, families, all smiling, unaware. On each photo, a face was circled in red. With shaking hands, I flipped through them until I found one that made my heart stop. It was us, taken when we first arrived at the campground. My face was circled. We raced back to camp, desperate to warn Mike and Chris about what we'd found. But when we arrived, they weren't there. We called out, our voices echoing through the empty campsite. No response. Panic rising, I reached for my phone to try calling them. No signal. Jake's phone was the same. We were completely cut off. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the camp, we heard a distant shout. It sounded like Mike. We took off running towards the sound, crashing through the underbrush. We found Mike at the base of a steep ravine, cradling his arm. He'd fallen while trying to get a signal on his phone. Chris had gone to get help, he said, but that was hours ago. As we helped Mike back to camp, a terrifying realization set in. We were being separated, picked off one by one. The strange locals, the missing supplies, the photos. It was all part of some sick game. Night was falling fast, and Chris was still out there somewhere. We huddled around our dwindling fire, jumping at every sound from the darkening forest. Where was Chris? And more importantly, what was hunting us? As the night wore on, our nerves frayed. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. We took turns keeping watch, but sleep was impossible. The forest around us felt alive, malevolent. Mike's arm was swelling badly, probably broken. He was running a fever, mumbling about eyes watching from the trees. Jake paced restlessly, jumping at every snapping twig. I tried to keep it together, but my mind kept going back to those photos, my circled face. Around midnight, we heard Chris' voice calling from the woods. Jake wanted to go look for him, but something felt wrong. The voice was Chris, but the cadence was off, like someone doing a poor imitation. We doused our fire and huddled in silence, listening as Chris called out, his voice getting closer, then farther away, circling our camp. This went on for hours, a psychological torture that pushed us to the brink. By dawn, we were exhausted, paranoid wrecks. Chris was still missing, Mike was getting worse, and we were no closer to understanding what was happening. But one thing was clear, we couldn't stay here. We had to make a run for it. We decided to make a break for it at first light. We packed what little we had left and piled into my truck. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. Someone had tampered with it during the night. Desperation setting in, we grabbed what we could carry and set out on foot. We hadn't gone more than a mile when we heard it, a low, inhuman growl, the same sound from that first night. But this time, it was joined by others. We were surrounded. Shapes moved in the trees around us, too fast to make out clearly. Glimpses of pale, twisted forms, somewhere between human and animal. The locals emerged too, their faces now masks of feral hunger. As they closed in, the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. The locals weren't helping these things. They were working with them, hunting with them, maybe even becoming them. We ran, our legs burning, lungs screaming for air. The forest blurred around us as inhuman shrieks filled the air. This was it, the confrontation we'd been dreading. And we were hopelessly outmatched. We tore through the forest, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. The creatures were right behind us, their inhuman shrieks spurring us on despite our exhaustion. Mike stumbled, his injured arm throwing him off balance. I grabbed him, dragging him along. We couldn't leave anyone behind, not now. Jake spotted a cave up ahead. It was a risk. We could be trapping ourselves. But we were out of options. We dove inside just as one of the creatures lunged, its claws grazing my back. The cave was deeper than we expected, twisting into the heart of the mountain. We pressed on, using our last flashlight to navigate the narrow passages. The shrieks of our pursuers echoed behind us, getting fainter as we went deeper. After what felt like hours, we emerged on the other side of the mountain. The forest stretched out below us, deceptively peaceful in the morning light. For a moment, we felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we'd lost them. Then we saw the figures emerging from the tree line, dozens of them, and they were headed straight for us. We had no choice but to keep running. Our muscles screamed in protest, but fear drove us on. We crashed through streams, scrambled over boulders, anything to put distance between us and our pursuers. The creatures were relentless. Every time we thought we'd lost them, those inhuman shrieks would echo through the trees, closer than before. They were toying with us, I realized, hurting us. As we ran, I tried to make sense of what was happening. These things, whatever they were, had been doing this for years. The missing persons reports, the abandoned campsites, it all made sense now. This was their hunting ground. Mike was getting worse, his fever making him delirious. Jake and I had to practically carry him between us. We were slowing down, and our pursuers knew it. They were closing in, their excited howls getting louder. Just when it seemed like we couldn't go on, we broke through the tree line. A road stretched out before us, the first sign of civilization we'd seen in days. A glimmer of hope sparked in my chest. If we could just flag down a car. As we stumbled onto the road, a beat-up RV came into view, parked on the shoulder. An older couple stood outside, looking concerned. The woman gasped when she saw us, our clothes torn and bloody. "Please," I gasped. "We need help. There's something chasing us." The man's eyes widened in recognition. Without a word, he ushered us into the RV. As soon as we were inside, he gunned the engine, tires squealing as we took off down the road. "We've been tracking these things for years," the woman explained as she tended to our wounds. "Ever since they took our daughter. They were hunters," they told us. Not the only ones, but part of a network. They'd heard rumors about Shadow Pine for years, but never had concrete proof until now. As we sped down the highway, the man kept checking his mirrors. They won't give up easy, he warned. Once they've chosen their prey, they'll follow to the ends of the earth. I felt a mix of relief and dread. We'd found allies, but this was far from over. The real fight was just beginning. We drove through the night, the RV groaning with every mile. But as dawn broke, smoke started pouring from the engine. We'd pushed it too hard. We were forced to pull over in a small town called Millbrook. The hunters, John and Sarah, had a plan. There was a sheriff's station in town. If we could make it there, we'd have a chance. But as we approached the main street, we saw them, the creatures, blending in with the early morning crowd, waiting. We were out of options. This was where we'd make our stand. John handed out weapons, silver knives, guns loaded with special ammo. "Aim for the heart," he said grimly. All hell broke loose. The creatures shed their human disguises, revealing their true, horrifying forms. We fought with everything we had. The quiet town turned into a battleground. I lost track of the others in the chaos. Gunshots rang out, mixed with inhuman shrieks and all too human screams. I found myself face to face with one of the creatures, its twisted features inches from mine. As we grappled, I could see the intelligence in its eyes. This wasn't just a monster, it was a predator, evolved to hunt us. With a surge of desperate strength, I plunged my silver knife into its chest. It let out a bone-chilling shriek and collapsed. The battle raged on. Town locals, realizing the danger, joined the fight. Some fell, but many stood strong. I saw Mike, his injured arm hanging useless at his side, backing Jake up as they fended off two creatures. John and Sarah fought like people possessed, their years of hunting evident in every move. But there were so many of them. For every one we took down, two more seemed to appear. Just when it seemed like we might be overwhelmed, sirens pierced the air. Police cars and what looked like military vehicles roared into town. The creatures, realizing they were outmatched, began to retreat. As the dust settled, I looked around at the devastation. The quiet town of Millbrook would never be the same. Neither would we. The official story was a terrorist attack. Men in suits asked us questions for hours, but I could tell they knew more than they let on. In the end, we were sworn to secrecy and sent home with a warning: don't dig any deeper. Weeks passed. On the surface, life returned to normal. I went back to UCLA, threw myself into my studies. But things had changed. I saw the world differently now, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering what might be lurking in the shadows. Mike's arm healed, but he was jumpier than ever. Jake dropped out of school. Last I heard, he was looking into joining John and Sarah in their hunt. And Chris, we never found out what happened to him. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear those inhuman shrieks in the distance. The rational part of my brain says it's just the wind or a car alarm. But deep down, I know the truth. They're still out there, hunting, waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that one day they'll come for us again. Because once you've been marked as prey, the hunt never really ends. It just goes quiet for a while.